Thank you very much. It's again a great pleasure to be in St. Petersburg, and I would like to thank Victor and Maria for hosting this meeting, which turns out to be a lot more attended than we expected. So, with that being said, this was a particular challenge for me because I spoke here last year, and so I assume that many of you already heard what I had to say. And then I also spoke at different meetings of the series of conferences dedicated to implicit learning, and so I'm trying to make up something a little bit different, and we'll see how it goes. So I will talk about consciousness in general, but in particular about the differences between conscious and unconscious processing, and I will look at the differences between what has been done in cognitive psychology and in social psychology. This is a big area of debate right now, the differences between experimental procedures and the conclusions obtained either in cognitive psychology or in social psychology. And it's all about priming. Before I get there, I would like to introduce a few ideas about methods and a few ideas about conceptual issues that have to do with the differences between conscious and unconscious processing. So, as one way of beginning this, here are two quotes, one from Sigmund Freud and the other from the American philosopher John Searle. So, Freud was saying about the unconscious that, properly speaking, the unconscious is the real psychic. Its inner nature is just as unknown to us as the reality of the external world, and it's just as imperfectly reported to us through the data of consciousness as is the external world through the indications of our sensory organs. And so Freud is defending a vision of the unconscious which is truly terra incognita. It is a separate system that is capable of processing information independently from consciousness, and consciousness only affords an indirect access, an access which, according to Freud, is as indirect as the access that we have to reality through our senses. And so, consciousness is this separate system that looks into unconscious processing, but unconscious processing is really what does the job, according to Freud. Yeah? And then we have this quote, which is completely different from John Searle, who criticizes this view of the relationships between conscious and unconscious information processing. And what Searle says is that at its most naive, our picture of the unconscious is something like this. Unconscious mental states in the mind are like deep fish in the sea. The fish that we cannot see underneath the surface have exactly the same shape they have when they surface. The fish do not lose their shapes by going underwater. What Searle means here is that Freud's vision of the unconscious is one of a symbolic unconscious, in which symbolic propositions, according to the computational theory of the mind and theorists like Fodor and so on and so forth, that we have symbolic propositions, language-like propositions, if you like, that are in the unconscious, and that can be just as causally efficacious when they are unconscious than when we are conscious of them. Yeah? And this is what Searle has a problem with in Freud's characterization of the unconscious. Now, as we will see, Freud's characterization of the unconscious keeps attracting followers who maybe would deny they are Freudians, but who tend to think in the same way when they think about the relationships between the conscious and the unconscious processing systems. And a lot of those followers are to be found in social psychology today. Of course, there's also people in cognitive psychology who have this view of the relationship between the conscious and unconscious information processing. But that's one area of debate. And one of the things I will try to do briefly is to suggest an alternative perspective on the relationships between conscious and unconscious information processing. Agnieszka Popławska said yesterday in her presentation that after 40 years of research about implicit learning and about unconscious processing in general, we still don't know much about the mechanisms of implicit learning. And this is true. If you look at, there's many theories of consciousness, which I won't have the time to go over. There's also many theories of how priming works, for instance, or about how we can learn without intending to do so. And this is surprisingly perhaps still an area of debate, and that's why we're having these meetings and this particular meeting here today. So one of the areas in common between cognitive and social psychology is priming. Now, priming is the phenomenon by which processing one stimulus results in facilitating performance in the processing of a subsequent stimulus, yes? So you can have repetition priming, where two items are repeated and the second presentation results in faster or easier processing. You can have semantic priming, for instance, where two items that are semantically related facilitate each other's performance. There's many different sorts of priming, and they all have been looked at both in cognitive psychology and in social psychology. Here's an example of priming. I'm sure you know this picture. Is anybody doesn't know this picture? Has never seen this picture? No, everybody has seen this picture. If you have seen this picture, you know that there's a Dalmatian dog hidden in the picture, yeah? The Dalmatian dog is here. Once you know that there is a Dalmatian dog in that picture, your processing of this particular stimulus will be forever influenced by your knowledge that there is a Dalmatian dog in the picture. It's an example of priming, supraliminal priming, but it's an example of where the processing of this stimulus is indelibly and forever influenced by your knowledge of the presence of the dog. Now, of course, in cognitive psychology, people have used this sort of procedure to look at priming. And so you have the presentation of a very short stimulus for 13 milliseconds, for instance, and this is masked by another stimulus. So people barely see or don't see this particular stimulus at all. They have to respond to the target here. And as you can see, the target is an arrow, and so if the arrow points to the right, they have to press right. If the arrow points to the left, they have to press left. But there's this target stimulus also acts as a mask, as a meta-contrast mask for the prime, which makes the prime invisible. Yeah? So different studies have shown that if the prime is congruent with the direction of the arrow, then processing the target is facilitated, even though the prime hasn't been seen. This is called subliminal priming. In this particular case, the arrow points in a different direction than the target arrow, and so you expect that performance would deteriorate. Yeah? It would be slower to respond to the target in this particular condition. So that's an example of priming where a subliminal stimulus now influences processing of a visible stimulus that is presented later. In social psychology, people have used completely different sorts of procedures, yet they have called the same sorts of phenomenon also unconscious priming or subliminal priming. Yeah? So for instance, here is a study that looked at, it's a very well-known study, that looked at the influence of a stereotype like being old on people's behavior. Yeah? And so what Barge did in that study was to ask his participants to perform what is called the Myers scrambled sentences task. Then people exited the lab, and he measured the speed at which they exited the lab. Yeah? So it's a very direct measure on behavior. Yeah? And then people were called back to be debriefed about the experiment. Yeah? So what is the Myers scrambled sentences task? Well, in this task, you get sentences like this. Actually, it's not a sentence, it's just a collection of words, and your task is to put the words together so that they make up a sentence. And when you do that, there's one word left out, and that's your response. And so people do about 30 of these. Yeah? So you rearrange the words, and then you get this one that doesn't fit, and that's your response. Yeah? You do 30 of these, and in one condition, all those words were associated with the concept of being old. So Florida, for instance, in America, is the place where old people go to rest, or to die, some say. And other words could be gray, could be sad, could be alone, and so on and so forth. All words associated to being old. Yeah? And in another condition, people were asked to do the same task, but all the words were associated to a different concept, or they were not associated to one concept in particular. Yeah? So the main result that Barge observed is that when people exit the lab and you measure the walking speed, people who have been exposed to the words associated with the concept of being old walk slower when they exit the lab, which is a really striking result. Yeah? So it's an example of priming, where you prime a behavior, which in this case is to walk slower, by means of this sentence task. But you can see already that it's completely different than what's being done typically in cognitive psychology. The words are visible. It's just that people don't realize that all these words are associated with the concept of being old. Now, we try to replicate this, and I will get to that later, and it doesn't work, in fact. If you do the experiment again, it works under certain conditions, but I'll get to that later. That paper was hugely influential. Right now it's been cited over 3,000 times. This was a 1996 paper, and it generated a lot of additional work on what's called in social psychology behavioral priming. Yeah? So for instance, there are studies showing that subliminal exposure to the logos of fast food restaurants make you impatient. There's evidence that incidental exposure to the smell of a cleaning fluid makes you more self-conscious of cleanliness when eating crumbly biscuits, for instance. There's evidence that sitting on a hard chair makes you a better negotiator. If you're buying a car, for instance, it's better to sit on a hard chair than on a couch. There's evidence that holding a warm versus a cold cup changes your impression of somebody you meet. If you hold a warm cup in your hand, your impression of the person you meet is more favorable than if you hold a cold cup. There's evidence that incidental exposure to a briefcase versus a backpack in a room makes you better at playing Trivial Pursuit. Yeah? All these are examples of social priming or behavioral priming, as it's been called. Yeah? And this has been picked up left and right by the media. It's the sort of stories that you hear talk about very frequently. Here's a bunch of additional examples. And these examples include examples of cases where the priming is very long term, yes? So there was one study, for instance, looking at brief subliminal exposures of a flag, for instance, that purportedly had effects on people's choices in elections that would only come months later, yeah? So, very striking. And to many people, just unbelievable, basically, these effects, yeah? There's a special issue of the journal Social Cognition that compares priming in cognitive psychology and in social psychology. And David Shanks, who's a critic of unconscious cognition in general, has a paper in there. And here's Shanks's problem with this research. He says that this priming, he quotes Barge, basically, and Barge, who's one of the main promoters of this sort of research, says this priming research has shown that the mere passive perception of environmental events directly triggers higher mental processes in the absence of any involvement by conscious intentional processes. So according to Barge and all these other authors in social psychology, we are sort of susceptible to being influenced by all sorts of environmental cues that we are not aware of, and yet that are capable of directly influencing our behavior, such as the speed at which we walk. And to many people, this is just implausible. And there's been many failed replications of these effects now. And so there's a real question about, well, to what extent are these phenomena real? Here's one rendition of the conceptual difficulty that some people have with these experiments. So you have Homer Simpson. You can expose Homer Simpson to the image of a donut, for instance, and that activates a high-level concept, such as the desire to eat a donut. And maybe this is translated in behavior, with Homer looking to find a donut and eat it. Now, what this research on priming suggests is that you can have exactly the same chain of events taking place unconsciously. This goes back to what Freud was saying, in a way, yeah? You can have exactly the same sort of events exactly the same chain of events in the absence of awareness. So you can present to Homer a subliminal donut, the image of a donut that is only presented for 10 milliseconds or something like that, and masked so that Homer doesn't see the image of the donut. And the claim is that this will also activate a high-level representation, such as the desire to eat a donut, and would, just like in Barger's experiment on slow walking, result in measurable differences in behavior. So that would be an example of semantic priming, semantic subliminal priming. Yeah? If you look at the social psychology literature, here is one rendition of the mechanisms that sit between exposure to a prime and observed behavior. And as you can see, in fact, it's horrendously complicated. Social psychologists have identified about 16 different moderators of the priming effects, so it really is a complex domain, basically. So this link between prime, a high-level concept, and behavior can be affected by lots and lots of different variables that have to do with the experiments, with one's representations, and so on and so forth. So, let me talk a little bit about the methodological issues that are involved in this kind of research, or in any research that looks at demonstrating unconscious cognition. Yeah? So one key difference is between sensitivity and awareness. You can be sensitive to some piece of information in the absence of awareness of that piece of information. And so you can think of this as involving accumulation of evidence. So in a priming situations, like I described, for instance, exposure to the prime would result in some evidence for responding left or right, for instance. The idea is that you have a first threshold that defines the extent to which the strength you need or the quality you need to achieve causal efficacy, yeah? To achieve behavioral sensitivity. So in a priming situation, for instance, is the arrow that is briefly presented, how long does it need to be presented to be able to influence the processing of the target? And then you have another threshold, and these have been called objective and subjective thresholds, that defines, presumably a bit higher, the strength or the quality you need for the corresponding representation to be available to awareness and to be available for verbal reports. Yeah? Now, if you're interested in demonstrating unconscious cognition, then you want to be somewhere between these two. You want to be at a strength which is sufficient to be detectable in behavior, but of course low enough that the stimulus cannot be reported. And this immediately poses what I have called the strength efficacy dilemma. That is, this is very difficult to achieve in general because you need stimuli that are weak enough that they fail to be reportable, yet strong enough that they exert detectable effects on behavior. And very often, if you weaken the stimulus too much, you fail to get priming effects. But if you make it strong enough that you have behavioral effects, then it also often becomes available to awareness. And so the entire game consists of making it so that you sit between these two thresholds, basically. Shanks and other critics of this sort of research have also pointed out many issues involving in determining these two thresholds. One is sensitivity. Of course, you want to make sure that your test of awareness is sufficiently sensitive. And so if you use a better test of awareness, that is, if you lower this threshold, often you find yourself in a situation where your effect disappears. That is, now you have a stimulus that influences behavior, but that is also reportable, which is not what you're interested in. Another issue is that these two measures, your measure of behavior and your measure of awareness, are often obtained at different moments in time. But that being so, it may be the case that whatever representation was driving behavior here has weakened, for instance, by the time that you measure awareness. So the test is not appropriate. Ideally, these two measures, behavior and awareness, should be obtained at the very same time. But if you do that, you run into the observer paradox, as I will discuss later. This is what Shanks had called the immediacy criterion. Now, of course, a third sort of issue that is important in this kind of research is that you also want to make sure that whatever you ask people about in your awareness test is about the same sort of information that you measure in terms of behavior. This is particularly important for research on implicit learning, where people learn natural-like stimuli, words, artificial words. Many of you know how this works. If you ask people, do you know the rules of the grammar that generated the strings? Well, it's not surprising to find a dissociation, because you can also demonstrate that, in fact, in order to carry out the grammaticality task, they don't need to know anything about the rules of the grammar. They can work based on something else, based on similarity between the test strings and the learned strings, or something like that, yes? So that's another very important criterion, relevance. In social psychology, almost none of these criteria are taken care of, yes? Very often, the tasks that they use fail one of these criteria: immediacy, relevance, and other criteria. It gets even more complicated because a lot of research on the neural correlates of consciousness has suggested that in many cases, when we look for the brain correlates or the neural correlates of consciousness, for instance, it's confounded with something else. So, for instance, performance, when you do a task consciously, always tends to be better than the same task carried out without awareness, yes? Somebody like Hakwon Low, for instance, tried to address this confound between consciousness and performance by using meta-contrast masking. That is, by using a priming situation where the prime is masked in the same way as in my earlier example, by the presentation of a second stimulus, the inner contours of which espouse the stimulus contours, yes? And meta-contrast masking has this U-shaped psychophysical curve as a function of duration between the prime and the target. So that it's only for the middle durations that separate the prime and the target that you get a weakening in visibility, yes? The prime is visible if the prime is presented immediately, if the target is presented immediately after the prime or very long after the prime, yes? It's in a very specific region that you get a weakening in, or a reduction in visibility. And so, using meta-contrast masking, Lau was able to find 2 points where performance is equal, but awareness differs, yes? So, 2 points on this curve where people perform at the same rate, the task, but in one case the prime is visible, in the other case it isn't visible. And so in doing that, he unconfounds consciousness with performance, because performance is equal in the two conditions. When you do that, you find just one region in the brain that correlates with consciousness, and that's the DLPFC, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. But the illustration is just that, okay, you think you have a good test of consciousness, but then it's confounded with performance. In a recent study, Frassel and colleagues showed that consciousness can also be confounded with reportability. And to do that, they used binocular rivalry, the phenomenon where you present a different stimulus to each eye, so that your subjective experience of the stimulus alternates between the complete perception of one stimulus or the complete perception of the other stimulus, spontaneously with a period of a few seconds. And in most binocular rivalry studies, which of course are interesting when you look for the neural correlates of consciousness, in most studies of of binocular rivalry, you ask people to report what stimulus they see at any point in time. Here, they found a method to infer what stimulus people are seeing without asking them. Yeah, and this involves using the optokinetic nystagmus. Yeah, so independently they've shown that this correlates with what people see, and so now they can run this binocular rivalry experiment without asking people to report anything. But they know that at some point in time they see the left stimulus, and at some other point in time they see the right stimulus. The point is that they get completely different neural correlates in the absence of the requirement for participants to report. In particular, they don't get frontal correlates. So these authors are saying, when you look for the neural correlates of consciousness, there's a confound between consciousness and report. When you remove the report out of the equation, you don't find frontal correlates anymore, which is very interesting. Consciousness is also often confused with attention, and there's been many studies trying to tease attention and consciousness apart. In general, they're complicated studies. This was a relatively simple one with intriguing results. So they used these stimuli with gratings in the middle, and people had to look at these gratings and indicate the direction in which the grating was oriented. The gratings were surrounded by this annulus, and letters could be presented on the annulus. The annulus acts as a mask for the grating. So by manipulating the annulus and the temporal relationships between the grating and the annulus, you can make the grating visible or invisible. So that's a consciousness manipulation. And by asking people to focus on the grating or on the letters and to do something with the letters, you can manipulate attention. So this is a very nice 2x2 design where consciousness and attention are manipulated separately. Typically they're confounded. And this was all done using a method known as continuous flash suppression. When you do this, you find neural correlates of attention, but no neural correlates of consciousness, which is very strange. You know? But again, I won't expand on that. But the point is, this is a further confound when you do research on the differences between conscious and unconscious information processing. All right, let me turn after this brief foray into methodological issues about conceptual issues. I told you Freud's characterization of the unconscious is one which assumes that you can find symbolic content in the unconscious and that this symbolic content can be causally efficacious. Now, if you look at classical models of information processing, such as Fodor's theory of computational theory of mind, or the idea that the mind is some sort of computer program, basically, representations always take the form of symbolic propositions, yes? Because they're like elements in a mental database, yes? But symbolic propositions cannot be causally efficacious unless they're accessed by the processor. So if you have a symbolic proposition, and if you think the mind consists of computer programs or symbolic programs, then those representations, those mental representations, if you assume that they take the form of symbolic propositions, to do anything, they have to be accessed by the processor, basically, just like in a computer. In a computer, you have memory, you have now information stored in memory, but that information on your hard disk cannot influence anything unless it's accessed by the processor. Yeah? The computational metaphor of mind works just like a computer. And so, you have an equivalence between causal efficacy and access. Something cannot be causally efficacious, something cannot influence behavior unless it is accessed. Now, awareness always entails access to some information. What it means to be conscious of some information is that you have access as an agent to that information. And so there's also an equivalence between consciousness and access in that computational theory of mind. Therefore, in classical models, causally efficacious representations are necessarily conscious. So in fact, you cannot have unconscious cognition if you buy the computational theory of mind. Actually, you can, but you have to do one of two things. One is to say unconscious cognition does not exist, which some people are saying. like David Shanks, for instance, he would agree with that, you know, there's no unconscious information processing. Or you have to say that you have two different notions of access. You have conscious access and you have unconscious access. And that's the picture that John saw at the beginning of my talk is against. It's the idea that you have an unconscious system, which is just like the conscious system, except that it's unconscious, yeah? But otherwise, everything else is the same. You have symbolic propositions everywhere, etc. And those representations are unconsciously accessed in the unconscious, and they're consciously accessed in the conscious system. So you have these two independent systems, an unconscious system and a conscious system. And this I find completely implausible as well, at least just as implausible as the idea that unconscious cognition does not exist. So what is the alternative? Well, you can get rid of these two premises. Representations take the form of symbolic propositions. Well, not necessarily. Symbolic propositions cannot be causally efficacious unless they're accessed. And you can replace that with the idea that representations are patterns of neural activity, and with the idea that patterns of neural activity are always causally efficacious. So if you get rid of the idea that what counts in cognitive science are symbolic propositions, and you replace the entire computational metaphor of mind by a connectionist metaphor, or a metaphor inspired by how the brain works, then you can see that what representations are just patterns of neural activity, and patterns of neural activity are automatically influencing other patterns of neural activity and ultimately behavior. There's no need for access to anything in that particular kind of system. You keep the idea that awareness of some knowledge entails access to the relevant representations, though. And that's how you can account for the difference between conscious and unconscious representations. So here is an example of connectionist networks. This is all work now. Not that many people are using neural network models today in cognitive psychology. But here is an example of a system that is able to recognize letters and words. It's a work by Jay McClelland, the interactive activation model of word recognition. And it's a system that instantiates constraint satisfaction. That is, the system is always trying to find out what the best interpretation of the data is. And in many cases, you can characterize connectionist networks like that. I'm saying this because I'm reminded of Victor's lecture yesterday, in which it was saying consciousness is about finding the best interpretation of the data. Well, this is precisely what connectionist networks do. Here's another example of a connectionist network that you can train on some patterns presented to the inputs of the network so that it produces certain outputs that you want, like a particular classification of the inputs. Now, in such networks, all the long-term knowledge, in contrast to what you have in classical systems, is contained in the connection weights. This is what drives the network. You have these connection weights that contain the long-term knowledge associated that the system has learned in virtue of interacting with its environment. And those connection weights produce activation patterns, representations in the network, and those representations often have the characteristic that they're distributed. Each unit is involved in many different representations. Each representation involves the activation of many different units. You can do brain imaging on these representations to figure out what such networks have learned. And in a lot of work that I won't have the time to describe, that's exactly what we did many years ago. And what you find are highly developed, highly complex patterns of activation that enable the network to make the appropriate classifications, for instance. Those patterns of activations are immediately causally efficacious, so they're not symbolic propositions sitting in the database. As soon as they exist, they influence processing. And they're also highly cryptic in virtue of the fact that they're distributed. So information is implicit in such representations. It takes some work to figure out what the network is actually representing. Yeah? And more recent work, what we did was to look at such networks and at the representations that they contain. And you can figure out what these representations do by using methods such as cluster analysis, for instance, which looks at the similarity of the different patterns of activation. And then you can find some structure, including some abstract structure. Yeah? But this is not visible if you just look at the patterns of activation here. It takes some work to do that. And one important characteristic of such patterns of activation is that even though they can be causally efficacious in the network itself doesn't have access to them in the way that we have access to our conscious knowledge. Yeah? So these patterns of activations, those representations, exist in the network. They can causally influence what happens on the output of the network, so they can causally influence, they can exert a causal influence on behavior, but the network itself doesn't have access to those representations. And that's why connectionist models naturally account for unconscious cognition. Yeah? We haven't spoken about consciousness yet, but I think these, in contrast to the standard computational theory of mind, are very good instances of models that make it possible to account for priming effects, for instance, and for all sorts of unconscious effects. Yeah? The trouble for those networks is to figure out, well, how can we have an account of consciousness? And in recent work that I won't have a lot of time to go through, what we thought was to imagine that there's a second network that looks at those hidden units here. So we have an observing system. And so according to this idea, consciousness involves an observing system. That's what it's a loop in the brain, in a way. It's an interactive loop in the brain. So consciousness, according to this idea, involves the brain looking at itself in the same way that we can look at internal patterns of activation in connectionist networks as experimenters trying to understand what they do. So the claim is that consciousness is doing that on itself, in a way, on the brain itself. The brain is learning to redescribe its own representations. So we have a second network in which you can have meta-representations, representations about other representations. And those meta-representations, it's a completely different talk, I think, are associated with consciousness. So the idea is this: you can have a network like that, which is a first-order network, which can learn highly sophisticated things, including artificial grammars, for instance. And this entire network is input to another network, a second-order network. This is the brain learning about the world. This is the brain learning about itself, performing signal detection on its own representations. So trying to figure out what itself is doing. In a way, consciousness works like a radar, according to this theory, which is congruent, and again, I won't have the time to develop this, with Rosenthal's ideas about consciousness. That is, it's a high-order thought theory of consciousness. Yeah? So consciousness works like a radar, in the sense that it's looking at the representations of the very system that produces it, by means of an interactive loop within the brain itself, by means of which the brain redescribes its own activity to itself. So how can you fool a radar? That is, how can you get unconscious cognition with such a theory of consciousness? Well, there's different things you can do. You can fly where the radar is not looking. You can fly under the radar, for instance, or you can fly just, in a direction where the radar isn't pointed at. You can be small enough, birds, for instance. You can have many, many birds, and they won't get picked up by the radar because it's not big enough. Or you can pretend you're something else. You're really a military plane trying to approach, but you're disguising yourself as something else. Yeah. So, the first case is a manipulation of attention. Can you occupy the radar's attention in a way that you can slip by without being detected? The second case is a case that involves subliminal or implicit cases. The third case is something that involves, and I will get to that, choice blindness. We saw a choice blindness example earlier, or the placebo effect. Yeah? In the placebo effect, that's exactly what happens. You're taking nothing, but you think it's something else. You think it's a medication. Yeah? This is congruent with the Hans taxonomy in a way. Because in the Hans taxonomy about the differences between conscious and unconscious information processing, you have top-down attention and bottom-up stimulus strength. Subliminal cases, or those cases, where a stimulus is attended, but it's very weak, yes? And then you have limited activation in posterior cortex, basically, if the information is visual, yeah? And he contrasts that with pre-conscious processing, where you have a sufficiently strong stimulus that is not attended. That is not attended, exactly. Yeah. One of the things that I will argue later, if I get there, is that those cases are typical of cognitive psychology cases. Yeah. All the priming situations in cognitive psychology have involved these sorts of cases. Many cases in social psychology have involved those sorts of cases, yeah? But it's not the same mechanisms and it's not the same phenomenon, yeah? So what is called unconscious here really is not unconscious, it's pre-conscious according to this taxonomy. So given the fact that awareness cannot be turned off, you have these three strategies that you can use in order to demonstrate unconscious cognition. Weaken the stimulus, change the narrative, that's the placebo story, or divert attention, basically. And I'll just review a few cases in each instances. How much longer do I have? 10 minutes? Huh? Yeah. So, weakening methods include backward masking, meta-contrast masking, continuous flash suppression, crowding, and all these methods. And these are all methods that are such that even when you pay attention, the stimulus remains invisible. But this is very difficult to achieve for the methodological reasons I described at the beginning of my talk. And details matter very much. And the main issue is that you're faced with this strength-efficacy dilemma, basically. We obtained results in my lab that sometimes suggest that you can get these effects. Other times, we fail to find relevant effects. Here is an example of unconscious sequence learning that we recently demonstrated in a psychological science paper. People were exposed to sequences like this with repeating elements. The order of the elements differ, and those sequences were presented subliminally. So people see nothing on the screen, basically. Yeah? I will show you how in just a second. One sequence was a rewarding sequence. When people detected that sequence, they could win €1. Another sequence was a losing sequence. When people responded to that sequence, they lost €1. The whole task was a gambling paradigm. To achieve invisibility, we used gaze contingent crowding, which involves presenting stimuli in the periphery of the visual field and using an eye tracker to make sure that whenever people fixate on the stimulus is replaced by a distractor. This really ensures high invisibility. I'm always certain, even though I'm generally skeptical, that people cannot process the stimuli consciously. Yeah? And so people see these sequences here, and then they have to make a decision whether to respond or not. If they choose to respond, then they can win or lose €1. If they choose to respond and it's the winning sequence, they will win €1. If they choose to respond and it's the losing sequence, they will lose €1. Or they can choose not to respond, basically. So it's a go, no-go situation. It's a go, no-go task. And after that, they have a visibility test in which basically we ask them to identify the sequence that was presented in the same way as during the main situation. And very briefly put, what we found was no difference in accuracy, but a difference in reaction time. Yeah? People react faster to the winning sequences than to the losing sequence when they choose to respond. That is in the go case. And this was obtained in the absence of visibility. chance level is 50%, we were exactly at 50%. Yeah? So this is a good example of a situation where we sit right between the causal efficacy subjective threshold area. That is, we can show that these sequences modify behavior even though people cannot describe them and cannot report on these sequences. In another priming experiment, we tried to use a different procedure which involved repeated priming. Tony Morsell worked on this in the 60s. So here you can have up to 20 repetitions of a number, and each number is masked, and so you cannot see the numbers. All you see is flashes, yeah? You see the masks, you don't see the numbers. And then you get a target number which is visible, and you have to make a decision about whether that number is smaller or larger than 5. And then you can get congruency effects between the invisible prime and the visible target, yes? So for instance, in this case, it's an incongruent trial. It's a congruent trial, sorry, because 4 is on the same side of 5 as 1, yes? And then we also have a visibility test. Now, what we found was a priming effect that depends on the number of repetitions. So for instance, with 8 and 20 repetitions, we get much faster response time on congruent repeated trials than on the other cases. Different trials, incongruent trials. So this is reflected by this difference between the congruent trials and the incongruent trials. But we get a correlated effect in awareness. So we also get a difference in prime detectability that is dependent on the number of prime repetitions. Yeah? So what we get basically is an association between reportability or visibility and causal efficacy. Yeah? So we can't really say that there was unconscious priming here, because the priming, the size of the priming effect goes with the visibility. Yeah? So in one case, unconscious sequence learning, we have this strong evidence for the ability of a stimulus to influence behavior in the absence of reportability. But in this other case, what we find instead is an association between the stimulus and its effect on behavior and its reportability. It's a mixed bag of results. So a second way of achieving invisibility is not to manipulate the strength of the stimulus, like in subliminal priming experiments, but to divert attention. There's many ways of doing that. Inattentional blindness, of which we heard from Maria this morning. Change blindness, you have all seen Dan Simmons' Gorilla movie, I guess. You can capture attention using the attentional blink procedure. You can manipulate working memory. You can overload perception and reasoning using complex stimuli. And I think that implicit learning, in many instances, is an example of this sort of strategy. In artificial grammar learning, for instance, you have visible stimuli, so it's not about subliminal perception. You have visible stimuli, but the information is sort of distributed among so many exemplars that people fail to be able to grab onto them. Yeah? So their attention is fully engaged, but the critical information is distributed amongst many different stimuli. With this sort of procedure, you have the observer paradox or refrigerator-like problem. That is, the more you probe awareness, which you need to do in order to establish that processing was unconscious, the more you attract people's attention to the very thing that they're supposed to remain unaware of. Yeah? So it's a different problem than the strength efficacy dilemma. But it's a problem nevertheless, because it suggests that it makes it very difficult to probe awareness in these sorts of situations. So here is an example. Some of you have seen this the stimulus. Here is an example of change blindness, which is different than the gorilla movie. So something is changing in the picture. I don't know if you can see it. Something is changing in the picture. It's right in front of your eyes. It's an example of a very strong, high-quality stimulus, and yet you fail to see what it's changing. And of course the question is this changing stimulus or could it influence your behavior even though you're not aware of perceiving the stimulus. What is changing is the expression of the central actor. So it's not a picture, it's a movie, 12 seconds, and the central actor goes from a neutral expression to a smiling expression. You should see it now, because it went faster, yeah? Artificial grammar learning, again, attention is fully engaged, so it's not really an example of diverting attention, like in the gorilla movie, for instance, but your mind is occupied with trying to figure out how these strings work, and even though all the relevant information that defines whether a string is grammatical or not is contained in these examples, it's very hard to find because it's distributed amongst these different examples. So in a way, this is a conspiracy of weak traces. Yeah, you have multiple features. Contextual cueing is a little. We heard about that this morning. Works a little bit in the same way. In social psychology, there was this study by Dexter House, which we also tried to replicate, which involved people watching the attributes of different cars. So they were shown, features like this. The KY is available in many different colors, and they were told to form an impression based on these attributes about what was the best car, basically. So they saw this for many, many trials, and I had to form an impression about which was the best car. And in the stimulus material, there was one car which had the best features, another car which had the worst features, and two cars that were in between. And right after exposure like this to these stimuli, Dexter House asked people to either think about the best car for 3 minutes before they make their response, or to solve anagrams for 3 minutes. That is to do a completely different task. And what he showed, surprisingly, is that when the decision involves a complex case, that is, each car is characterized by 12 different aspects, not thinking about what the best car is works best. Yes? So you solve anagrams for 3 minutes, and you make a better decision than if you really think about the problem. Now, that was taken to be a very strong demonstration of unconscious thought, as Dexter House called it, about the power of the unconscious. It's this idea that sometimes when you're confronted with a complex problem, it's better not to think too much about it, yes? But to let your unconscious solve the problem. Again, I won't have the time to go into the details of this, but we tried to replicate this experiment, and even though we did replicate the experiment in the end, after testing 700 people and failing, we ended up replicating this experiment, but we had a completely different interpretation that does not involve unconscious thought. I think it doesn't make sense, unconscious thought. You're not thinking unconsciously. When you're thinking, it's always consciously, yeah? Now, there's a way to make this work, and to understand why you get an advantage of solving these anagrams, but it doesn't involve unconscious thinking. This is the slow walking experiment that I described earlier. This we also try to replicate. That's the paper. It generated huge interest in the literature because that social psychology experiment by Barge was a very famous experiment, and the fact that we couldn't replicate it made a lot of noise. It even prompted Nobel Prize winner Danny Kahneman to ask priming researchers in social psychology to do something about it. But roughly what we found is that we could replicate the slow walking effect, but only if our experimenters expected their participants to walk slowly. So it's an expectancy effect that is driven in part by the beliefs of the experimenters. Yeah? But you also need the primes. So the Srow-Myers scrambled sentences task. You also need that. You need the primes, and you need the expectancy by the experimenters. Yeah? So it's a combination of the two effects. Exactly which mechanisms are involved? Well, this is a matter for further research. We still don't know. We also showed in that study that people were more aware of the fact that they had been exposed to words associated with the concept of being old than Bartsch described in his data. Yeah? So the final strategy that you can use in order to slip under the radar, so to speak, is to change the narrative. And this just illustrates the power of consciousness. You know, all these studies in social psychology and some studies in cognitive psychology, I told you, were picked up by the media, and we all have this impression now that, you know, we can be influenced by all sorts of things in our environment without awareness and so on and so forth. But really, you know, consciousness is even more powerful than all these unconscious effects, which typically are very small and fleeting. Now, you can talk about placebo effects, suggestion, hypnosis, expectancy effects, cognitive information like a brand, magic, and so on and so forth. You know about the effects of beliefs, for instance, in a brand. This is the famous Pepsi challenge, yeah? So you make people taste Pepsi or Coke. If you don't give the brand, people systematically prefer Pepsi because it has more sugar. And this is reflected in brain activity, so you can do this in a scanner. People prefer Pepsi. But if you tell them what they're drinking, they prefer Coke. Yeah? So if there's brand information, they systematically prefer Coke. And what the authors of this particular study were able to show was that the frontal cortex, which represents the brand information, was able to modulate the regions of the brain associated with the experience of pleasure in such a way as to make people experience more pleasure now when they drink Coke than when they drink Pepsi, yeah? Which is very striking. It's just illustrative of the power of a conscious belief or conscious knowledge. Yeah? This has very strong effects. We carried out a series of studies about the effects of suggestion on Stroop performance. That works quite well. It's sort of smallish effects, but it works well. So if you make people believe, for instance, that they can see colors better because they're hooked up to a fake EEG machine that enhances the brain's ability to process color, then you can reduce Stroop interference when you ask people to name the colors. Yeah? Amir Raz showed the same effect using another suggestion under hypnosis that people were unable to read. Yeah? That works very well in terms of reducing the Stroop effect as well. The Stroop effect, which is thought to be an automatic effect, yeah? So it's striking that you can manipulate it just by beliefs, basically, or by manipulating people's beliefs. The placebo effect in clinical studies, this accounts for 30% of the effect of any treatment, yeah? So if you take a pill, there's some effect driven by the medication or the substance that the pill contains, but there's also 30% of the ultimate effect, which is driven by your belief that it's going to work. Yeah? This is massive. This is really huge. And again, it's a conscious effect. Some people have claimed that they've shown a subliminal placebo effect, but I still have to read the paper. So, it's very hard to demonstrate causal efficacy in the absence of awareness. You have the strength efficacy dilemma, the observer paradox, the reported effects are generally small and fleeting. It's very easy, by contrast, to demonstrate the causal efficacy of conscious expectancy and conscious beliefs, placebo, and the reported effects typically are huge. There's a strong distinction, which has been systematically overlooked, I think, between unconscious processing, which typically involves subliminal presentation, and pre-conscious processing, which typically involves some sort of manipulation of attention, like in Dijksterhuis study, to some extent like in Bartsch's study. But those studies, typical of social psychology, systematically involve supraliminal stimuli and people's diverted attention. They don't really realize what they're doing. Yeah? But then this opens the door to all sorts of methodological difficulties as well. And I think that most social priming studies involve then, at best, pre-conscious processing. So, I think that we love this idea that we're not in control, yeah? And this is why these ideas stay so prevalent from Freud onwards, yeah? We love the narrative that we could be influenced by all sorts of things in our environment. I think we can, but we really have to rethink the way in which we consider the distinction between conscious and unconscious information processing. We should replicate experiments as many times as we can. Most of these social psychology studies have never been replicated. And we should systematically compare in our studies conscious versus unconscious processing. So we should document what happens with consciousness, we should document what happens without consciousness, but we should also document what happens when people believe there's a stimulus, for instance, versus not. Yeah? So I think there's a lot of work to be done about conscious beliefs. That's it, thank you.
Спасибо большое. У нас есть время на короткий вопрос.
Professor Cleeremans, thank you very much for your extremely interesting speech. And my question is about insight. As Viktor Mikhailovich told yesterday, it is a situation when the very high level, high quality and casual efficient representation appears in our mind spontaneously. And my question is about how did it hide from our consciousness radar before? Is it some kind of blindness for our own representation, isn't it?
That's a very good question. Insight is a fascinating situation. Of course, all our conscious thoughts, I think Victor said this yesterday, find their origin in unconscious processing. Yeah? So there's a deep connection between conscious and unconscious processing, but I think that really no theory today truly captures what, the nature of this distinction and how we should characterize it. In the case of insight, yes, of course you think of something that grows in your unconscious mind and then at some point achieves sufficient strength to manifest itself. But maybe it's something completely different. Maybe it's an external stimulus that prompts, maybe the thought wasn't there before. Maybe there was nothing before. Maybe it's just that the right conditions take place at some point in time and you have this insight which you realize was an answer to a problem that you were trying to solve before. Yeah, I have one particular story to tell about this. This is not so much about insight, but I remember driving my daughter to school, and the two of us were really looking for the name of an American actor in a movie, and so we spent this short trip, 10 minutes, but still, we spent 10 minutes trying to figure out what's the name of this guy, what's the name of the actor, and we couldn't find it. Yeah. A week later, I find myself in the same spot, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, the name of the actor pops to my mind. Yeah? So I was thinking, well, it's either, there's two possibilities. One is, and it's not so absurd, that a search process was initiated a week before and kept going at different times and unconsciously. And eventually, a week after, came up with the right answer, which it presented to my conscious mind, and then you're okay. But another possibility, and there's really no way to rule that out either, is that the name popped to my mind for some other completely unrelated reason, something I heard on the radio or whatever, and I just recognized that that particular name was the name I had been looking for before. Yeah? And so I had this subjective experience of, oh, I finally got it, but maybe it had nothing to do with it, So there's good research to be done about that.
Connected to the sense of agency, actually, in this case. Yeah. Just continue. Еще один вопрос. Мистер Cleeremans, у меня вам вопрос. Как вы считаете, возможно ли существование такого человека, для которого те барьеры, которые вы говорили, нижний барьер, на который происходит воздействие, и верхний барьер, на который происходит осознание? Возможно ли такое, чтобы у какого-то человека эти барьеры находились в сознании? То есть он осознает все воздействия, оказываемые на него?
As far as I understood, the question is there a person for whom two thresholds that you were talking about were actually on the same level? So kind of gathering together on the same level?
As a person?
Yes, the question is there, could you imagine such a person existing for whom there will be two thresholds working together?
I'm not sure if you want to think of this in terms of persons or just particular domains, yeah? So in most domains, the two thresholds are equivalent, yeah? Because you're aware of many things that you do. In many cases, though, you don't have complete access to whatever it is that you're doing, and so you have this dissociation between the two thresholds, yeah? I think it's by domain. All these cases illustrate the situations where you can have a distinction between the two thresholds. In many other cases, you will find associations between the two thresholds, as I've described them. So there would be one, yeah? And there may also be different individual differences. That's true. Some people seem to be more aware than others. Some people seem to have more metacognitive ability than other people. More insight into their own, into their own mental representations. Yeah, Stephen Fleming showed this. There are strong differences, in fact, in people's ability to gain insight into their own behavior, and you can even track those differences to differences in gray and white matter in the frontal cortex. So yes, there are individual differences. Thank you.